이 컴퓨터가
네,
음성으로
이렇게
되니까 그래. 그다음에 여기 지금 두 개 다 깔았어?
네.
여기 파워포인트에?
네네.
오케이.
2번, 3번.
Hi everyone. 문 닫아라. 채팅으로 하나 할까? 채팅?
아까 왔더라고요. 그때 테크니컬 프로블럼 있었던 학생이 I'm sorry for
그 다음에 내가 보내려면
그냥 여기다 타이핑 하시면
여기다
돼요.
하면 되지.
네.
Okay, I have graded your midterm exam result. Most of you have done very well, except a few questions, and I will probably email to you not only grade, solution of the midterm exam through Evgenia, Professor Evgenia, and Professor Park, and so forth. So please take a look at my solution and my graded result. Of course, your grading result will be, I hope, individually sent to you through two professors, okay? Today, we will get into a list modernization story in China. We are supposed to cover very long period of time, roughly from 1850 to roughly 2010. This period can be subdivided into two parts. China's modernization effort before 1945, when the World War II is over. And then after 1945, China has taken socialist development, typically. So we will take, roughly we can say that China lecture note 2 and lecture note 3, and both I hope was related to you. So let me open China. Let me see, lecture note 2. Is this part 2? It says part 2, transition to modern economic growth. Okay. 오케이. 더 크게
슬라이드 쇼?
괜찮아? 슬라이드 쇼 할까? 이게 더
학생들이 더 잘 보여요.
그래, 슬라이드 쇼로 하지.
처음부터.
Okay. This is a under the title of Transition to Modern Economic Growth, right? First, we can take a look at the growth of foreign trade. Despite the Western countries' attempt to force China to open to free trade, the late Qing government resisted these attempts because the country was largely self-sufficient and had a highly developed system of internal trade, which assured sufficient supply of goods for traditional demand to most of China's region. So in other words, the self-sufficient characteristic of Chinese economy has somewhat prevented Qing government to open forcefully to foreign trade. Thus, China's foreign trade during the early period grew only very slowly, but its pace picked up with a steady weakening of the government. When the Qing government became weaker and weaker in the mid-19th century, and foreign trade began to grow to some extent. During the Republican period from 1912 and 1949, the trade volume continued to surge and reached its peak in 1926 and 30. Here is the notion of Republican period is important. What is Republican? That means after the kingdom. In other words, after the king's governing dynasty, China was politically moving toward Republican system. In other words, a more sort of non-kingdom, civilian-based sort of modern political system. So during this period, roughly from 1912 to 1949, the trade volume continued to surge and reached its peak in 1926 and 1930. However, in the 1930s, China's external trade was heavily impaired by external and internal political economic factors. First, the Great Depression of 1929-1939. The restoration of China's tariff autonomy and the subsequent revision of tariff rate by the Republican government. The loss of Manchuria to Japan and the outbreak of Sino-Japanese War were the main events. Okay. Share of trade in national income kept increasing. Up to the 1930s, the relatively low share of China's external trade can be explained by two factors: huge size and traditional patterns of China's domestic economic environment, and the failure of its trade policy to utilize its trade potential fully. So up to this part, China was somewhat stagnant in external trade. On the other hand, as you will see next session, Japan has made remarkable progress in opening up their country during this period and engaging themselves in active external trade. So this is in contrast between China and Japan. Okay. According to Kuznets, he was a Yale professor, very famous economic growth specialist scholar. The trade share is negatively correlated with the size of country measured in terms of its GNP. What does that mean? The more the country is bigger, or the larger the country is, its trade share is smaller, compared to other countries, but positively correlated with its stage of economic development, measured in terms of its national income per capita. So according to this Kuznets hypothesis or Kuznets proposition, China is definitely belonging to this first type, large GNP, large country, therefore negatively correlated with the size of, with the trade share. On the other hand, China also was somewhat not high national income per capita, so positively correlated with the stage of economic development. China was necessarily, therefore, very low in terms of trade share. So the size of China's economy was much larger than that of Japan, and its stage of development was much lower. So belonging to this, in other words, China is the perfect example of validating, making Kuznets hypothesis, Kuznets proposition correct. China is a kind of validation example economy to some extent. So you can take a look at this share, for example, but later on, as you can see it, from 1916, roughly, export amount is triple, and very rapidly increasing. Imports also increasing rapidly. And trade balance-wise, trade deficit kept increasing. You can see, take a look at, particularly during the early 1990s, or 1900, right? Early 20th century, okay. Foreign trade spurs a country's economic growth through either the demand side or the supply side. The demand side means typically what we in macroeconomics we call export multiplier effect. So if typically export is increased by $1 billion, GDP is increased more than $1 billion. And that effect in macroeconomics we call export multiplier effect. Also, through the supply side means that when foreign trade comes in and goods are in and out. So for example, from the supply side, suppose you need some key components of your manufactured goods and key intermediate goods, raw materials, or key components could be imported, then you can increase your supply capacity, right? If you are limited in trade, if you cannot import a lot of materials, raw materials, intermediate goods, and components, then your supply side is blocked. Okay, so both demand side through export multiplier effect, supply side through the intermediate goods trade and raw material goods trade, supply side is, increased. So export accelerates economic growth through its effective demand creating effect. And that as I mentioned, typically in macroeconomics, we call export multiplier effect. So multiplier means if export increased by $1 billion, GDP is expected to increase more than $1 billion. So it gets accelerated, demand creating effect. Growth contribution to output growth is increment as a percentage of the increase of GDP as the ratio of its growth rate compared to that of GDP weighted by its share of GDP in the base period. So relative growth contribution of exports in Japan was much higher than that of China due to its relative higher export share in GDP and export growth. And therefore, Japan was benefited by export creation. In other words, export sector added to GDP growth and the supply side more effectively than in China. Okay, so in Japan, these effects get magnified, accelerated. So relative growth contribution of investment, consumption, exports to China between like 1914 and 1931-36, these two sub-periods. Relative growth contribution in percentage, GDP is 100%, investment is roughly 25.4%, consumption increase roughly occupying about 63%, but exports relatively very low. It increased contribution rate, relative growth contribution from 0.76 to 1.25, but still relatively very low contribution compared to investment or consumption. Okay. Industrialization effect. In Japan, modern industry was initiated by trade with Western countries. So importation of new foreign products. And then they created import substitution. And then they moved to export expansion. So it's like South Korea's development pattern. First, at the beginning, import substitution, but later, export expansion. Flying geese pattern is a kind of geese flying. In other words, one nation flies first, and then other nations follow the first nation flying. So this is a flying geese pattern was initiated, kind of invented concept by Japanese scholars to sort of as a propaganda of Japan. Japan becoming dominant nation in Asia, and they created like co-prosperity area in East Asia, and Japan's is like flying geese at the front, and then China, Korea, and Taiwan all follow. So this is kind of intellectual academic proposition laid out by Japanese scholar. And that said, flying geese pattern. And catch-up industrialization is a late developing nations are trying to catch up in per capita income toward former or front developer. In other words, for example, Taiwan, South Korea trying to catch up industrialization to the standard of Japan. For example, China as a late industrializer trying to catch up Japan or United States. So that phenomena we call catch-up phenomena. The speed of China's catch-up industrialization was much slower than that of Japan. Okay. Production and consumption in selected industries, China, and the ratio of production and consumption. And if you see, for example, corn yarn, cotton yarn and cotton cloth, and Japan and, for example, iron and steel industry, for example, you can see the pattern of the sort of catch-up industrialization. Okay. Trade structure. Industrialization reduces the share of primary exports and increases that of manufactured goods. Of course, industrialization means increasing manufacturing goods share in both production and export. In imports, share of manufacturers declines, whereas that of primary products imports increases. And that you have seen. Now it's easier to understand these concepts because you have learned, examined South Korean case. So these trade structure change is exactly the same as South Korea's early development stage. China's exports were initially dominated by primary and handcraft products, with tea and silk together accounting for roughly 94%. Can you believe it? In 1868. So they didn't export anything except tea and silk. So primary good exporter, China, not manufacturing good exporter by as early as 1868. Okay. China and Japan's trade structure in their transition phase, you can take a look at and verify what we have just examined. Foreign investment is a key factor in industrialization and played a critical role in the early industrialization of both the old and new industrialized countries. China is the best example of the beneficiary of industrialization through foreign investment. After Deng Xiaoping's open door policy from early 1980s, China has become industrialized through foreign investment, open door policy. Okay. Foreign investment consists of both foreign loans and foreign direct investment. And we used to call foreign loans investment portfolio investment, financial investment. Foreign direct investment is like Toyota Motor Company directly investing in their Beijing plant, establishing a joint plant or a single plant in Beijing, China. That's foreign direct investment. But on the other hand, foreign investors, financial investors can make loans to Chinese authorities, Chinese enterprises, then that's foreign loans investment, foreign financial investment. Two types of investment, right? So foreign loans and FDI, for example, in payment, out payment, And you can see the trend here, foreign loans. On the other hand, FDI kept increasing to some extent, foreign direct investment. So as a result of successive public borrowing, China's debt ratio rose between 1894 to 1930 from roughly 0.3% of their GNP, to 7.0%. Okay, so that ratio typically is computed investment savings gap. This I minus S is what I refer to when you remember when I was discussing South Korean development case. The first type of gap is investment savings gap. Savings is like funding, supply of funds. Investment is demand for funds. If investment is greater than supply, we say investment savings gap exists. And then growth rate of GNP can be denoted as GY minus I, interest rate. So if GNP growth rate is 5%, interest rate is 2%, then this becomes 3%, right? Okay. So investment minus savings is kind of investment savings gap. So we call this as debt ratio, debt to GNP ratio, and you can estimate this by if you are given these data. Okay, foreign loans normally entail a positive net resource transfer for the debtor countries. However, in pre-war China, the reverse was the case for foreign loans. Did not result in net resource transfer to China, but vice versa. The political penetration of China by the West brought the irony that China's pre-war foreign borrowings, instead of being used to augment domestic savings in China to finance capital formation, were effectively used as a vehicle to channel domestic savings out of the country to finance the capital formation of other countries, especially that of Japan. What this means is, political penetration of China by the West has consequence. In other words, has a result that China's pre-war foreign borrowings were not used for the Chinese industrialization purpose, but it was channeled into Japan's development. In other words, savings out of the country to finance the capital formation of other countries. That was kind of irony. Okay. So we can remember this is most important event, historical event you should remember. We call Treaty of Nanjing. And foreigners, you remember this year is 1842, right in the middle of 19th century. Foreigners were given extra territoriality rights in the treaty ports and were allowed to set up their own enterprises in China. Initially, they were restricted to the non-manufacturing sector, for example. Nevertheless, foreigners set up 142 manufacturing enterprises in the period from 1842 to 1894. Most of these were located in Shanghai and were largely confined to ship repairing, building, and the processing of primary products for exports. And then what happened? There was a Treaty of Shimonoseki, 1895, 50 years after Nanjing Treaty. Manufacturing sector was open for foreigners. Most favored nation was given. MFN means any country trading is given most favored nation status. Okay, so there is no discrimination by country. So number of manufacturing foreign direct investment increased by 337 during 1895-1916 due to this most favored nation status and manufacturing sector being open for foreigners. So foreign banks were established, railways and mining attracted the largest amount of foreign direct investment in terms of value. Okay. Beijing period of the Republican government. In other words, kingdom was demolished and the new Republican government was established during this period. The number of domestic market-oriented manufacturing, FDIs, soared. The disruption of foreign supply caused by First World War occurred. In anticipation of pending upward revision of China's tariffs after the restoration of tariff autonomy. So Nanjing government period followed, 1928 to 37. There were few new FDIs in China proper. Japanese FDI, I think this, make a correction. That should be Japanese FDI in Manchuria kept growing very fast. Okay. The average annual FDI inflow, which had remained relatively stagnant during the late Qing period, jumped sharply in the early Republican period and declined thereafter due to World War II. Most of China's pre-war FDI was in the service sector, especially in import-export trading, banking, finance, and transport, chiefly railways. The share of foreign capital in China's manufacturing sector rose from 10% to 20% between 1913 and 1936. The benefit of FDI for the host country can be real and financial. They arise from the extra financial resources which fill in the foreign exchange and investment savings gap. And FDI also impacts on economic growth and structural change. However, in pre-war China, the direct financial benefit of FDI was largely negative, since annual outpayments connected with FDI constantly outstripped more than increased in payments. Okay. Theoretically, FDI has the potential to accelerate economic growth by boosting capital and export growth, by absorbing unemployed labor as a source of new technology, as contributor to export growth, backward-forward linkages with domestic enterprises. This is a little bit technical word, backward and forward linkage effect, which means, for example, suppose you are establishing a steel company, the steel making company, like a POSCO, Pohang Steel Company. That company is expected to increase forward linkage effect. This is a more input-output economics concept. Forward linkage means the industry affects forward industries. What is forward industry? Okay, once steel making company is established, that steel can be used for automobiles, can be used for shipbuilding, and shipbuilding can affect, shipping transport. Automobile industry can affect battery industry, computer industry, and so forth. In other words, downside, further increase in linkage effect. We call that as downstream linkage effect or forward linkage effect. On the other hand, backward effect is behind this industry. So, for example, suppose I establish large cloth making or, fiber making or maybe clothing industry. Okay, then to make clothes, you need cotton import, you need silk import, right? In other words, that industry's background industries are also affected. So typically, forward linkages is larger for the basic industries like steel, cement, computers, all these basic industries. Backward linkages will be greater for those consumer industries, consumer products industries, because those industries backward is occupied, affected by raw material, intermediate goods industries. So this backward forward linkages is a little bit difficult economic concept, but if you read, for example, input-output tables or input-output economics, you can catch the, the words, definitions. Again, forward linkage is what? One industry's after, downstream affected. How about backward? That industry's upstream industries will be affected. Okay, so that way you can think of forward linkage as steel company, steel industry, steel making, backward, fashion forms, some fashion goods like clothing goods industry. You can think of backward linkage can be maximized. In pre-war China, the capital contribution of FDI to growth was negative since there was a net outflow of capital, as I mentioned. Since most FDIs were not export-oriented, their contribution to China's export was rather limited. Most FDI was into their railroad system and service area, service industry. Remember, previous chart showed that most FDIs were into service industries, including like railroad and commercial outfit, things like that. So their contribution to China's export was rather limited because service industry is not tradable industry, non-tradable industry. Hence, the growth in pre-war China was mainly driven by internal forces, especially growth in the agricultural sector. Just the opposite case of, for example, Japan. In case of Japan, pre-war Japan was mainly driven by not internal forces, but by trade forces, external forces. And especially growth not in the agricultural sector, but manufacturing sector. That's why Japan could stage a war. To stage a war, to begin a war, against the United States and allied forces, they need some materials, manufacturing goods. They need tank, they need ships, they need gunboats, they need equipment to carry out war. That means Japan's industrialization was very impressive industrialization before 1945 compared to China's industrialization. The most significant real benefits of FDI on pre-war China was its structural effect, for it helped to create and share the modern sector comprising factory industry, mining, modern transport, utility, construction, and communication. So these are not usually not manufacturing sectors, but service sector oriented development. Summary. In spite of the fact that Japan and China were opened up to free trade at about the same time, China's foreign trade grew much slower than Japan's and remained relatively unimportant to the Chinese economy in the pre-war periods. Its structure also remained relatively unchanged, with traditional exports of primary and handicraft products still dominant in 1935. However, imports to China experienced significant changes with a declining share in manufactured goods, especially in light industry due to growing import substitution, particularly clothing and other articrafts and other simple labor-intensive goods. A lot of companies were import substituting, so that happened. At the same time, there was a greater share of primary products in imports as a supply of raw materials to some extent. The contribution of trade to growth of the economy in the Qing period remained negligible. And even in the Republican period, trade accounted for only roughly 8% of Chinese GDP growth. However, it did contribute to the structural change of Chinese economy in the form of catch-up industrialization based on the flying geese pattern. The impact of foreign loans on the Chinese economy was largely negative because they were in most cases used to finance indemnity payments. In other words, to finance loan payments or interest payments to cover military and administrative expenditure. So foreign loans impact were somewhat not impressive. Between 1894 and 1930, China's debt ratio rose due to increased cost of borrowing and the ineffective use of foreign loans, which resulted in the growth rate of GDP being lower than the interest rate on foreign loans. So worst of all, foreign borrowing did not augment domestic savings to finance domestic capital formation. So foreign borrowings were used as a channel to transfer domestic savings out of the country to finance the capital formation of other countries, especially in the case of Japan. So the role of FDI was crucial and positive only in respect to technology transfer, for it initiated and helped to shape the very small modern sector of the Chinese economy. So industrialization in China began with the setting up of modern manufacturing and mining enterprises in the late 19th century. Foreigners and gentry officials functioning as compradors played a major role in China's early drive to industrialization. Initially, foreigners dominated China's modern industries but they were soon overtaken by Chinese nationals. So ownership structure of modern manufacturing in China, number of enterprises, foreign ownership was dominant, but became later occupied by Chinese ownership, replaced by Chinese ownership. Okay. In the period between 1914 and 1936, the modern industrial sector grew at a very fast pace due to disruption of external supply lines in the First World War, the currency depreciation, and increased tariff protection. So this period was helped by industrialization due to disruption of external supply lines in the First World War, and then the currency depreciation and increased tariff protection. So the industrial sector was dominated by the light industry and was concentrated in the two provinces of Liaoning in Manchuria and Jiangsu in the Yangtze Delta River area. Despite its high rate of growth, the contribution of modern industries to the overall growth of GDP was limited because of its insignificant share in Chinese economic output in that period. Contrary to the Marxist assertion, the rise of modern industry and increased foreign imports did not drive the traditional handicraft industries to the wall. Their output continued to expand because of the increased demand from both domestic and foreign sources, and their products remained competitive because the handicraft industry is specialized in labor-intensive products and made out of the abundant supply of surplus labor. So this is, for example, source of agricultural growth between 1890 to 1933. Population grew, cultivated area marginally grew, land-man ratio deteriorated to some extent. That means population growth was higher than cultivated area growth. So agricultural output has increased. Agricultural yield also increased, very marginally. Okay. The rise of modern industrial sector laid the foundation for modern economic growth, which, however, did not materialize until mid-20th century. The main reason was that growth before this turning point was largely due to the expansion of traditional industries. For example, agriculture, handicraft, traditional service sectors, and so forth, not necessarily manufacturing sector. So you can check the sectoral change during this period. For example, agriculture used to be 69% occupying GDP, slightly went down, but not significantly went down. Modern manufacturing increased marginally, 3%. Things like that can be compared. The rise of modern sectors and their impact, agriculture remained the mainstay of Chinese economy and continued to expand in the transition period to modern economic growth through the late 19th century and early 20th century. Its rate of growth between 1815 and 1936 averaged about 0.6% a year, very steady but very slow growth rate. This growth resulted from increases in both acreage, units of land, and in yield. Yield means, productivity. So per hectare or per land unit, how much are produced? That we say yield. Okay. So per capita GDP estimates, if you look at, you can see that in terms of US dollars, $48 to $52, according to Dwight Perkins' estimate. According to Yuan's Yuan estimate, yes, economists, yes, Yuan estimate, very little gain. According to Madison's estimate, very little, not much progress was made. Actual annual sectoral growth rates can be observed. For example, there are two estimates by Ye and Rauski. And as you can see, agriculture is about 60% weight, but increased very little. On the other hand, modern manufacturing industry, including mining, increased very sharply. And other sectors you can check. So the opening of Manchuria for Han Chinese settlement accounted for most of the increase in acreage. And the increase in yield was mainly due to the diversifying of crop patterns to higher value crops other than grain on the basis of greater commercialization of agriculture after the opening of China for trade by the Western powers. In other words, diversifying agricultural products, higher value-added crops, such as, for example, some vegetable or seeds and non-grain products, has contributed to increase in, for example, yield, productivity. Okay, and that was helped by Manchuria area settlement by Han original race, Chinese race called Han. Han race settled in Manchuria and tried to cultivate Manchuria area. The comparison between China and Japan on the eve of their transition to modern economic growth, MEG is just an abbreviation, shows that Japan's initial conditions were much more favorable than China's. By the late 19th century, Japan had a higher level of social and economic development, and its economy was more urbanized and commercialized. And as you will learn from Japanese economic history from next class on, Japan was already into late 19th century into republican system under the title of Meiji Restoration. So Japan was first very opening up their economic structure to foreign trade, and therefore Japan could carry out modernization much earlier period. But China, due to internal struggle, political and war between Chiang Kai-shek Republican Party and Mao-led Communist Party, they were into engaging in internal war over 50 years during this period. So they lost the opportunity of early development. On the other hand, Japan, under Meiji Restoration, united and became Republican nation and very rapidly went through economic development and modernization. It also had a higher per capita income and the higher growth rate of the agricultural sector to support its industrialization. And Japan's economic structure in the late 19th century can be compared. For example, Japan agricultural share is almost 40%. On the other hand, China's agricultural sector, 68%. You see, manufacturing, for example, occupied 6.6%, but for example, other sectors occupied a lot higher percentage. Okay. Its transaction sector was much more developed. Why Japan succeeded and China failed, which lowered Japan's transaction costs and allowed it to embrace the growing specialization and division of labor required for modern technology. So again, growing specialization means rather than concentrating their labor force on so many different industries, specialized industries like fabric, garment, or some manufacturing goods. And division of labor, therefore, division of labor means different job classifications. So you put your work effort to manufacturing. Others put their effort to merchandising, marketing. So this division of labor was created in Japan, but was not created in China adequately. Okay. Why Japan succeeded and China failed? The share of transaction sectors in GDP, China, Japan, and other low-income countries. For example, trade sector occupied China 9.3%, 2%, Japan 9.3%, other low-income countries 12%. Finance, Japan was 1.0%, and low-income countries 0.6%. Real estate, both China and Japan about 3.6%, government services about 3.1%. So in terms of share of transaction sectors in GDP, China, Japan are pretty similar, except finance sector. Finance sector, Japan was already getting highly developed. Its society, Japan, was also more willing to embrace modern technology due to its long history of borrowing culture and technology from China and to adapt. In other words, Japan was early adapter of Chinese technology through Peninsula of Korea, or not necessarily through Korean Peninsula, directly from China. But China did not experience any borrowing culture and adopting technology. The population had a higher rate of literacy and enjoyed a longer life expectancy than China's. So human capital was superior, better in Japan than in China. It had a social structure that had promoted the allocation of entrepreneurial activities to productive activities. It had a family system which encouraged capital accumulation and which hired labor on the basis of merit rather than blood type. So these are socio-economic characters. Thus, Japan was much more ready for modern economic growth. And that is obviously one of the major reasons why its transition to a modern economy was so much faster and smoother. The other decisive reason lies in the role of government, which is especially important for latecomers to industrialization. So we call this latecomers industrialization as late industrialization. And the role of government, as you know, is very important. Japan's government was strong and proactive, but China's was weak and small. Japan controlled between a quarter and fifth of GDP from tax revenues. China languished only 3% of GDP from revenue. That means about 25% of GDP goes to Japanese government, originates from Japanese government. On the other hand, China commanded only 3%. Most of revenues in China had to be spent on military campaigns, foreign indemnity payments. Indemnity payments means foreign loan principal and interest payment. Debt servicing means, debt servicing is a payment against debt, that is principal and interest. So that China's transition government could do very little, nothing, to promote industrialization or modern economic growth. Japan's government was ready and in a position to adopt a forward-looking policy to promote industrialization. Its approach was two-pronged in that it created a favorable business environment for the entire private sector by maintaining political stability through maintaining law and order and repelling internal rebellion and foreign aggression. On the other hand, China could not do this. It further constructed social overhead capital in that it introduced Western institutions and established a modern banking system. In addition, the government was actively involved in introducing and diffusing Western technology by way of identifying and subsidizing strategic industries like shipbuilding, later automobile, many chemical companies, things like that, cement manufacturer, steel manufacturer, things like that, strategic companies and industries. Chinese transitional government was weak, with its sovereignty under constant attack by foreigners and severely impaired. Thus, it was unable to maintain political order and stability. So, for modernization, for economic growth, there is nothing more than important than political order and stability, one way or the other. Whether or not it is a military government or non-military government, political order and stability is the must. For example, the current event in Myanmar, political order and stability is not there. Therefore, Myanmar's economic development will be deteriorated. Besides its reluctance to embrace the values underlying modern economic growth and confining itself to the borrowing of selected technology and heavy industries, the limited resource base of Chinese government would never have enabled it to take and implement decisive steps to promote modern economic growth. Thus, its attempts of institutional and political change were late and limited in scope. So institutional and political change were very fast and full scale in case of in case of Japan. On the other hand, in case of China, institutional and political change were late and limited. It did not carry out any active industrial policy until the late 1930s, and its monetary reforms proved to be a nail in its coffin. So National Party led by Chiang Kai-shek and Communist Party led by Mao made an alliance to fight against the Japanese invasion. Nanking Massacre is late 1937 after a bloody victory in Shanghai over a period of 6 weeks. Imperial Japanese army forces brutally murdered hundreds of thousands of people, both soldiers and civilians, in the Chinese city of Nanjing. Japan's Central China Front Army, General Matsui Iwane, Chinese soldiers were killed by the thousands, tens of thousands of women were raped. The Japanese burned at least 1/3 of Nanking's buildings. We call that Nanking Massacre. Remember, that is late 1937. Of course, before World War II, right? From mid-1948, the National Party's army were defeated by the Communist Party's Red Army. So end of April in 1949, when the Communist Army crossed the Yangtze River, the National Party led by Chiang Kai-shek left Nanjing for Guangzhou in Guangdong province and ultimately settled in Taiwan, evaded from mainland China. The US plan to give up Chiang government in early 1950 was stopped by Kim Il-sung's invasion into South Korea, the Korean War. So the US Navy 7th Fleet sealed off the Taiwan Strait to block Taiwan's attack to China mainland and Communist Party's attack to Taiwan. So to some extent, Korea's Korean event, the Korean War, was related to Taiwan and China struggle. Okay, so that ends kind of second part of China, and let us open the third part. Right?
이거 창 치워보시면 드래그 내리시면 공유 중지 버튼이 있을 거예요.
그 위에 떠 있구나.
아까처럼
공유를 하고 이걸 누르죠.
네.
Okay, so an economic history of modern China part 3 is at least the period being covered is the period you know well enough, modern economic growth under socialism. So we can think of 공유가 중지가 됐대. 화면 공유를 다시 가서 이거였나?
앞일 것 같은데요.
Okay, so we can begin. Here, the first few pages is referring to the Soviet model. The theory underlying the Soviet model of rapid industrialization, of course, was adopted by China in the late 1950s, was the so-called Feldman growth model, which had been formulated in the 1920s during the great industrialization debate by Feldman. The development of heavy industries is only the vehicle for accelerated growth of the downstream. This is downstream consumer goods industry. So in other words, heavy industry first developed that will affect downstream consumer goods industry. That's the Feldman theory. The two sectors in a closed economy, investment goods sector and consumer goods sector. And production factors are capital and labor. Then capital stock does not depreciate. Rate of change equals to the investment output of capital goods in sector one. For example, why if capital stock does not depreciate, why rate of change equals to investment? Suppose you have 100 computer last year. Now suppose you have 200 computer. Then decay, the change in computer stock is 100, right? So the change in computer stock is equal to total investment. That means this year I ended up investing 100 new computers. Okay, so that's what we mean by the rate of change in capital stock equals to the total investment. Okay, so this is a Feldman growth model. You don't have to really know in detail Feldman's growth model. But roughly speaking, this is something like this. VI is kind of gross output, and GY is kind of value added. And so lambda I is kind of coefficient of gross output, and in other words, this is how income, which is value added, created by creating output. Growth model itself is just too technical for you to understand and very much simplified and skipped. So, but roughly speaking, Feldman model emphasizes sector one, investment goods development first. That will affect consumer goods industry. So in other words, Feldman growth model emphasizes heavy investment goods. In other words, heavy investment goods sector industrialization first. That will affect consumer goods light industries later. So sector one first, sector two later is the motto development goal Feldman growth model has played. China in the early 1950s initiated the wholesale transplant of Soviet institutions and policy into the country, and in particular, the system of collective agriculture, collective farms, state enterprises, central planning, the administrative allocation of production factors, the use of price seizures to extract agricultural surplus to finance heavy industrial development, and the adoption of autarky policy into international economic relations. So all these Soviet-style development pattern was policy adopted in early China, in early 1950s. Okay, so share of state investment in industry, for example, Before 1953, 1957, it was heavy industry 47, light industry 6%, but kept increasing share of state investment, as you can see, reaching totals over 60% from 53%. Okay. And collective farm, collective agriculture. The collectivization of Chinese agriculture was preceded by the land reform of 1949-1952. Remember, this period, similarly, Republic of Korea carried out land reform. But they say that Korea's land reform was a successful case, but Chinese land reform was a failure case. Why? Land and other agricultural resources were expropriated from landlords and rich peasants and distributed to poor and middle-income peasants. The major objective of the land reform was political, in that it aimed at consolidating the political base of the Chinese Communist Party in rural areas. For example, this shows the Soviet model, development of collectivization in Chinese agriculture. So very rapidly collectivization of Chinese agriculture proceeded. Agricultural surplus as a fuel for industrialization. In the Maoist area, agricultural surplus was siphoned off from farmers to fuel industrialization in the form of various visible and invisible taxes which farmers had to pay under the compulsory agricultural procurement scheme introduced in 1953. So farmers did not have incentives to invest in refarming and agricultural sector because their profits were siphoned off from farmers to fuel industrialization by the government in the form of tax. So China's 1955 agricultural industrial output and 1967 targets, you can see this, and the Chinese agricultural sector did not make any progress. Farmers' tax burden sharply increased. Okay. In addition to agricultural sector, other factors affected Chinese Soviet model adoption. State enterprise in the non-agricultural sector, the large formerly nationalist or foreign-owned enterprise became first state enterprise. Central planning was adopted, as in the Soviet Union. Resource allocation in the Maoist era was through central planning, with the farm planners' preferences largely determining who produced what, how much, and how. Factor allocation and the role of price, inter-enterprise mobility was severely restricted, means from one enterprise to another enterprise, raw material shipping, intermediate goods shipping, components and machinery shipping were all restricted, as was spatial mobility. Spatial mobility means from one place to another moving was controlled by the household registration scheme. So you cannot move from Shanghai area to Manchu area, from Manchu area to Shanghai area. So control of inflation. China's planners controlled inflation by balancing supply and demand for consumer goods. So what happened is demand is determined by wage times labor, number of people or number of working hours. So W times L is wage bill. And QA times PA is agricultural product, price, income, and then supply of agricultural product. So anything left over here, you sell this one and supply, the difference will be a surplus. But China's planners control the inflation by balancing supply and demand for consumer goods. So if demand is high, they try to make supply high. And when supply is low, they try to suppress demand. So this type of control of inflation would be okay if production system remains the same, stable. But when there are no more incentives, farmers were not cultivating enough crops, then control of inflation fails. So China largely followed Soviet model with the collectivization of the economy and its adoption of system of central planning and resource allocation, tight control of production, capital and labor, its growth strategy, and its foreign trade. The only major difference was China's faster pace of collectivization of agriculture and Mao's greater emphasis on the development of productive relations in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution strategies, by which he tried to force the pace of the development. This shows you, 1949, December 16, after World War II, Moscow, Kirov, and Mao's first time visit to Soviet Union. And you can see this picture is a kind of Moscow Kremlin. Mao is signing agreement with the Soviet authority. And this ship shows great leap forward, Mao's approach to socialist development. Here is affluence, welfare, and production relations. Fully socialized communism increases affluence. So this is kind of chart. On the other hand, capitalist and feudal situation. Capitalist system becomes stagnant. On the other hand, when fully socialized, affluence increases. It's kind of great leap forward strategy. But in reality, all of these things failed. So great leap forward in order to realize the goal of putting China in competition with the USSR, Soviet Union, for the leadership of international communist movement, the gradual development approach enshrined in 1954 Constitution was discarded. They should have adopted gradual development approach, but it was discarded. In May 1958, at the 8th Communist Party Congress in Beijing, a new development strategy known as the Three Red Flag Strategy was announced. The first red flag represents the new strategic line of socialist development, which is summed by the slogan, go all out, aim high, achieve better and faster results. The second red flag stands for Great Leap Forward. The third flag represents the people's communes. The gist of this strategy was to speed up socialist and economic development in China. But what happened? Several policies implemented in Great Leap Forward period were geared to achieve rapid socialization and industrialization. And this goal was in conflict. Rapid socialization did not go hand in hand with industrialization because rapid socialization killed private incentives, entrepreneurial spirit, private investment was killed. So industrialization did not materialize through rapid socialization. The formation of people's communes, working on two legs policy, the introduction of active planning, a drastic increase in the rate of investment. The working on two legs policy means one leg on socialization, the other leg on industrialization. As I said, this is in conflict, could not be materialized. So the people's communes, the first commune was formed in Henan in April 1958. And their formation spread like fire all over the country. With the encouragement of the great leader and the approval of Politburo of Chinese Communist Party. By the year's end, 753,000 advanced agricultural cooperatives have been merged into 26,000 people's communes, and the rate of peasant participation has reached 99%. With the establishment of PCs, people's communes, China's collectivization had gone well beyond the Soviet model in several respects. So it even surpassed Soviet model of collectivization. So what was the consequence? The policy of working on one leg on socialism and following the Soviet model of industrialization, using large-scale, capital-intensive, urban-based industry as the motor of development, aggravated the magnitude of China's problem of unemployment in the cities. So China's problem of unemployment was most serious byproduct effect. It also neglected the development of industries in China's rural areas and increased rural-urban divide. So even at the present time, China's most serious economic problem is rural economic and urban economic divide. Rural-urban divide is most serious current modern-day Chinese economy. To address these problems, the policy of working on two legs was introduced, which aimed at simultaneous development of both large-scale capital-intensive urban industries and small-scale labor-intensive rural industries. And that okay, so the Great Leap Forward, China's rate of investment and its allocation in the year of the Great Leap Forward. For example, rates of investment did not increase, slowed down. Share of industries, almost no change in heavy industries. Light industries declined. Why? Because light industries like clothing industry, were originally developed as private industries, merchants, and they were given no incentive. So they disappeared. Therefore, light industries' share became even lower than 1958. Okay. So outcome of the Great Leap Forward movement, contrary to Mao's expectation, the Great Leap Forward movement failed to achieve the anticipated great improvements in industrial and agricultural development. The famine resulting from Great Leap Forward sowed the seeds for the Cultural Revolution. And as will be discussed, the backlash against it precipitated the initiation of China's economic reforms and the introduction of open door policy after Mao's death. Okay, so we will stop here. Maybe next class I will continue to examine slide 25. Okay, please mark it, Eugene. Okay, continue about the outcome of the Great Leap Forward. Slide 25 from next class. Okay, I'll stop here for modernization of China and socialization of Chinese economy at this point. I'll be happy to answer for your questions.
I have two questions.
Okay.
I have two questions. Any teaching PhD
Could you
student?
speak a little bit volume up?
Yes, now better? Now better?
Yes, better, much better.
Yeah, I have two questions.
Okay.
Evgeny Tishik, a PhD student from Irkutsk. All we know about opium wars, Boxing Rebellion in China, Meiji era in Japan. If we compare China and Japan in this case, which economy was more open to FDIs in 19,000s? And the second question is, can we compare flying geese scheme economy with leapfrog scheme in economy? Great forward. For example, can we say Japan is flying goose and China is some kind of leapfrog?
No.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good question. For the first question, China and Japan FDI, what had happened, I emphasized political stability is the key to open the economy into the external forces. So for example, China from roughly 10 to 1945 virtually was engaged in internal war between Chiang Kai-shek, Kuomintang Party, and the Communist Party, Gongsan Party. So they could not really stabilize economic conditions. So when the economic conditions are not stable, foreign direct investment cannot be made effectively, right? Foreigners are not going into the country because it is very too risky for them to invest in the country. So already existing foreign investment were siphoned off to Japan, as we reviewed. Already existing foreign investment was given to Japan. I mean, ran away to Japan. That's one question. Second, flying geese and leapfrogging is two different concepts, okay? Flying geese is kind of imitation. In other words, flying geese pattern, which was created by Japanese scholar I think I forgot his name, but the Japanese scholar created that concept in the sense that dominant, in the first tier, only industrializer like Japan flies first, and Taiwan, South Korea, and China all follows. So this is kind of a pattern of economic development, almost in a very clustered East Asian cultural area, you know. So it does not have to be repeated in other parts of world, like Africa or South America. We don't see these flying geese pattern. Okay, so this is a pattern of development. On the other hand, leapfrogging means the following story. In the process of catch up, right, there could be two types of catch up. One, very slow and steady catch up. That could be typically maybe Japan trying to catch up American technology. It has taken them 30 years, 50 years to catch up American standard. But for example, South Korea, catch-up style can be termed as leapfrogging. So it jumps up. It is not smooth transition. So, you know, South Korea, in case of semiconductor industry, has surpassed Japanese semiconductor industry. And mobile phone technology, South Korean technology is right next to Apple technology, surpassed Nokia, European technology, or Japanese technology. We may say this as a leapfrogging. Leapfrogging means it's not smooth technological catch-up. It is jumping up from one stage to another, and then jumping another again. It's almost like step function-like pattern of catch-up. So that I hope answers your question. Okay? Any other question? Okay, again, you can send me individual questions by email. And I must say something about your submission of class assignments. And I said the new deadline will be April 7, by next class. Some of you may want to add more summaries. Some of you who have not submitted maybe can submit new summaries. So it's up to you, you know. So I'm extending the submission deadline without giving you any penalty. Late submission is okay. You know, reading should be voluntary. You know, reading should not be imposed on you. It is on you voluntary kind of reading. You know, so if you can add some more reading summary, fine. Or if you want to extend the submission deadline, I sent to Professor Chang and Professor Evgeny that by Katok, that submission deadline can be extended to April 7, okay? Next class, by next class. Any other question? Okay, I'll adjourn this session and I hope to see you next week. Thank you.